So our lives are full of surveys. You see them all over: newspapers, magazines, radio, television. The decennial census is done every 10 years. There's many government surveys. The election polls, very timely right now. We're starting to feed into that cycle. There's surveys on policy issues. Sometimes you get surveys from organizations we like. And a very popular thing right now is being asked to rate purchases you made. So straight from the headlines. So we're going to give some real-life examples today. Here are some that we're going to talk about. Poll finds even split on issue of rebel flag. A rare public poll in Castro's Cuba. We're going to talk about these surveys today as well as others. College sexual assault. Survey reinforces breadth of problem. Poll shows drug prices moving higher. Survey results worry gay rights activists. Which of these 5 surveys can we trust, and why? So before we talk about the headlines, we'd like to cover types of pseudo surveys you may have encountered. So there's 2 things called frugging and sugging. Frugging is fundraising under the guise of surveys, and sugging is selling under the guise of surveys. We're not so sure how often sugging still occurs, but we still see a lot of frugging. So here's some examples that Fran received in the mail. They send them in different shaped, typed, colored envelopes. They try to catch your attention. They say things like second notice, or you are asked to represent, Virginia. And you think this is very important, participation notice, participation gift enclosed, do not bend. I'm going to have to open this up and see what kind of gift they put in here. So here's the participation notice, here's the survey, here's the envelope to mail it back, here's a little brochure, aha. Here's the gift. Address labels.
I can use those. Thank you.
So here's an example of frugging. Following is a list of ACLU strategies for moving freedom forward. Please indicate how important you find each of them. There's questions 1 to 3. Number 4 is the ACLU runs a vigorous media outreach, public education, and grassroots organizing efforts to inform and mobilize people about ways to strengthen and expand individual liberty in America. Very important, somewhat important, not very important, not important at all. So this is an example of frugging. What answer does it seem like they're looking for here? Yeah, they're leading you to certain answers for sure. But here we come to question 5. To help the ACLU confront those seeking to undermine the Constitution and sweep away our fundamental freedoms, will you send a contribution today? So this is often what you find in frugging surveys. It's the surveys, but really here's the main point. Get you to write that check.
How many people have gotten one of these surveys?
So a different type of pseudo surveys are when you're asked to rate your purchases or services. You get these in your hotel room and when you make an online purchase. A restaurant survey in a payment folder. Car repair surveys, and these, sometimes they're very, they're rated on this, so they're really encouraging you. If you can't rate us all 10s, let us know what we can do. How many of you filled out this type of survey? Yeah, maybe not quite as many, because,
Well, they didn't fill out the other one. They just got it in the mail.
That's true. I didn't ask that. Be careful what you ask. And there's lots of other volunteer type surveys, when you're asked to click now to give your opinion, or when you're on a call for customer service or some other reason, stay on the line to take a brief survey. Or, when you're on a web page or printed in newspaper, asked to take the survey. There's something called opt-in panels where you're asked to join up and take surveys. And sometimes they say you're taking surveys for money. So there's a lot of different types for pseudo surveys. And most of these, what they have in common is they're volunteer surveys. So they're not doing a statistical sample of the survey population. In fact, the definition of the population itself is ambiguous. And they make little or no effort to reach the entire population. So the conclusions that can be drawn from these surveys are obviously not as great as the surveys we'll talk about next. And often they have these closed-ended answer categories to give the feel of a statistical survey, but without the actual rigor involved in most surveys. Fran.
Well, we're going to talk about those standard 2 types of survey errors that if you ever took a class on this will be part of the class. And we want to spend a little bit of time on sampling errors just to make sure everybody understands them. As most of you probably already know, it doesn't take all that many people to estimate the U.S. population. What do we have, like 300 million people in the U.S., and it only takes 400 people to represent them? But that's at a plus or minus 5%. If you want to get to a 3%, you need about 1,000. I've noticed that several of these surveys I reviewed had 1,200 people, which is a plus or minus 2.8%. I guess that was a little more rigor that they wanted. But it takes about 10,000 to do plus or minus 1%. And again, I do see surveys, that seem to 10,000 samples. So these are very popular sample sizes.
Where do the percentages come from?
A statistical calculation.
What I'm asking, how do you know that that's right?
It's a statistical model.
Assuming that there's
Yes. I didn't mention that it's a 95% confidence interval. So what this says is that this estimate is that 95% of the time you would be within a plus or minus 5% of the actual answer. So if you come up with 54% of the people said that, yes to this question, you'd have to say that the real answer is somewhere between 49 and 59. And so that's what the theory is. That's statistical theory. Whether you agree with, there's many other factors, though, in judging whether a survey is a good survey or not. So this is just one of them. All right, so here's the first survey headline that we had. I'll repeat the headline. Survey finds even split on issue of rebel flag. Okay, so this is the Quinnipiac Poll at Quinnipiac University. This was done in July of 2015. And their sampling error was plus or minus 2.8%. And they came up with the survey about them being evenly split. 45% said the flag should, let me give some background for those of you who aren't familiar with Virginia politics. We have a Sons of Confederacy license plate that you can use in our state, and it had the Confederate flag on it. And so there was a lot of controversy about this year. And so some people wanted it removed, and some people wanted it to stay. And what happened was Terry McAuliffe, the governor, said that it's going to be removed, and they sent new license plates out to everyone that has such a license plate so that they will no longer be displaying the Confederate flag as part of state business. Okay, so 45% said it should stay on there, 46% said it should be removed, plus or minus 2.8%. These are tied, right? So 46% is not higher than 45% in the survey when you have a plus or minus 2.8%. Okay, so everybody kind of understand what we're talking about with sampling errors? Because we're going to need this later. Now, then they go on to say that they had done this, that Quinnipiac University had also done a poll in April of 2015, and they'd ask about Governor Terry McAuliffe, and they wanted to say that disapproval ticked up on in terms of it gone from 28% in April to 31% in July. This is disapproval. Okay, so did indeed the disapproval tick up?
But how would you, if you were on a newspaper, how would you write this?
You'd say
If it's both plus and minus 2.8%, and you assume that, then both those figures would seem comparable. You're saying one is minus 2.8, one's plus 2.8. What do you say?
You say Virginians are evenly split. Now, this is a rookie error. The woman who wrote this article is in their Virginia bureau, is in their Richmond bureau, and I think if it had been done by one of the people that we know from my Survey Research Association, this would have never been, this error would have never been made. And I went on the website to see if maybe somebody had seen it besides me and changed it, but the website still has the story as published in the paper. Yes?
Just to clarify, when you say that there's a post with sampling error, 3% either way, are we also then, and now this is going into probability, and maybe we shouldn't, but is that assuming there's a 50% probability that it can go that, either direction.
No, there's a 95% probability that it could have gone either way.
But it's assuming a random, yeah, I think it does assume.
It assumes that people were selected randomly. Yes, that's true.
Well, and just as a follow-up, like, let's say that, in that sense, if I look at this and I say, okay, in April it was 28% plus or minus 3, but now in July it's gone to 31% plus or minus 3.
Right.
Wouldn't it be accurate to say that the midpoint has, in a sense, if that midpoint has moved,
The midpoint's not relevant, only the range. That's what we're trying to tell you today. The range is what's important. And when the range overlaps by 3%, the way it does here, you can bet that this answer, if you did another survey, you probably would not come up with
okay, I
this
just want to
answer.
make sure I understood
Yes.
the logic.
Yes, the
Okay,
logic
thank you.
is that with 95% certainty, if you did another survey of these two groups, that you probably come up with different answers and they'd probably be, they might be closer together. Okay, now we're going to go to our next headline. This was a rare public poll in Castro's Cuba. And indeed, this is a rare poll because you can imagine that since we haven't been getting into Cuba lately to do too many polls, the Washington Post teamed up with Univision, that they have a lot of experts on Spanish-speaking surveys. And this was conducted in April of 2015. It was a household survey. So they actually went to people's homes in Cuba and interviewed them and took random samples. They did a great job of this. They actually talked to 1,200 Cuban adults who had identity cards proving that they were Cuban. They did a 7-day pilot to test the methodology to make sure it was right before they actually started conducting the survey. They got a 39% response rate, and they had a design sampling error of plus or minus 2.8. I told you we'd see that number a lot, 1,200 and 2.8. Okay, what were their findings? Well, one of the questions that they asked that we're kind of interested in is, would you like to leave and go live in another country? And 55% said yes, 37% said no, and 8% didn't give an answer. So what do we think? Do more people say that they'd like to leave and go live in another country, or is the sampling error going to screw this up? What do we think?
Looks like more people want to leave.
It is more people. Even plus or minus 2.8%, these numbers are far apart. And to which country would you like to go? Well, this was a subset of the yeses. So now we're down from 1,200 to only 660. And the U.S., 52% would like to come to the U.S., 22% to Europe, and 26% to other. And
Europe isn't a country.
well, they combined
believe
all
they
the countries that people mentioned into the category Europe. Remember, this is reporting the data, not reporting the question wording. Okay, so is the sampling error still plus or minus 2.8% for this subset of yeses? No, it is not, because they only have 660. And remember, when we got close to 400, it was plus or minus 5%. So this 660, I looked it up in the Post's, online information about the survey, and it was more like 4%. It was a little under 4%. But 4% plus or minus, U.S. versus Europe, what do we think? Do we trust the data?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so what do we think about it being this many people that would like to leave Cuba when only 39% responded to the poll? What do we think about that?
You wonder if it really represents people who self-select for some reason
Yeah.
to participate.
Yeah, that they love the U.S., and so they let the Washington Post come in and talk to them in their home, right?
Well, they're not, they trust them, and they're not afraid of a knock on the door in the night based on their survey answer.
Right. This is a rare look at the Cuban population, and that there are at least some people who want to leave the country, right? We know that. And I think, that if you have, several polls and they're coming up with the same thing, you might trust this more. But I think, it's a good survey. I'm not sure if I trust it completely because of the low response rate. Okay. Now we're going to start talking about measurement errors. The difference between what we want to measure and what we actually get. That's what measurement error means. Okay, so I'm trying to measure how many people want to leave Cuba. Was there something about the way I measured it that was bad, so that I didn't get an accurate number? So here's some of the topics that we picked out to look at. The first is the sponsor of the survey. And we think that this is the number one thing, that people are going to need to look at. Kristen's going to talk more about these. The wrong respondent, you just didn't get the right person. The wrong question, just wasn't worded right. The wrong time frame, and then we're also going to talk about respondent burden.
So as Fran said, this is an important topic. Who do you trust more? If these are the different types of sponsors, a corporation, the government, a university, a newspaper, survey organization, a trade association, a hospital, which of these would you trust more?
First one about the same.
About the same. So, yeah. Okay. Others?
Maybe a newspaper?
Maybe a newspaper. Okay. You people don't trust anyone.
I trust a survey organization probably the most because they would have had a track record. You could say, do they show a bias in their surveys in the past?
You can look at the history, of them. How about the least? Is there any of these that you say, oh, that would make me nervous to trust that? Yes. Okay, so a trade association and a corporation, they might have reasons to, spin the results or to design a survey in a particular way that maybe these others don't have. Okay, we're going to talk about a few of these. So the government, in general, there's U.S. statistical agencies that have many years of experience in history conducting surveys. Their goal is to provide high-quality, accurate data. Three that have been testing with respondents face-to-face to improve survey quality are the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the National Center for Health Statistics, CDC. And usually when you see survey results from these three agencies and some others, you can feel fairly confident that they're following the basic survey quality protocols and, are doing that. Another one, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, they've also been testing surveys for over 35 years, focusing on survey quality. And they're sort of the congressional watchdogs for government programs. And so a lot of the surveys they do feed into their evaluation of the government programs. Some universities. A lot of universities are very well respected in the survey field. We're talking two examples here. The University of Michigan, they have a survey of consumers that they've been doing since 1946. It asks about consumer confidence in expenditures, and you often hear the results of that related to the economy. They do a Monitoring the Future survey since 1975 that looks into teen attitudes and behavior regarding use of cigarettes, drugs, and alcohol. In fact, the Washington Post had an article on this survey in September 2nd, and it was titled, "Why College Students Are Now Smoking More Pot Than Cigarettes." Too bad the why answer was a theory by the researcher and not based on the actual survey data. But what the survey did show was that had moved into that direction, but it didn't really answer why. Washington State University has a survey, Social and Economic Sciences Research Center that was started by Professor Don Dillman, and he's a very well-respected survey researcher. In fact, at the end of the talk, we recommend his book if you're looking for to do some further reading. So the survey organizations that you talk about, a lot of them do have survey methodologists on staff. There are some that are nonprofits and some that are for-profits, and some of them do work for others. They're funded by a client, and then there's some that are funding their own research, and two that fund their own research are the Pew Research Center and Consumer Reports. Some examples of other survey organizations are Westat, NORC, Gallup, and you might have heard their names as well. Okay, so the wrong respondent. There's two main problems with getting the respondent wrong. One is, are you capturing your survey population, and two is the use of surrogates. So here are two survey populations. How registered voters plan to vote. And then landline users. What are the problems with those groups?
When you say landline user, you're talking about a person using a phone as a person who doesn't have a phone.
Yes. So historically, there was an issue with when you did telephone surveys. There were people who didn't have any phones at all, and you weren't representing them. Now, of course, the issue is that people don't have landlines in their homes anymore, and they use their cell phones. And there's the cell phone only population households now cover 45% of U.S. households, according to estimates from the National Health Interview Survey. That was release of 2014 data in June of this year. And that's probably gone up since then. So you can see that if you were only calling landline users, you wouldn't be representing your survey population. Exactly, so they're skewed in a certain way. And the registered voters, the issue with that is that not all registered voters will vote. And what you really probably want to know is likely voters. Yes?
Excuse me, with the landline users, how do they determine which phones are landline? Do they look at a listing of area codes?
There is. There are separate cell phone exchanges and landline exchanges, yes.
First survey mentioned a survey done by a phone association, I forget what you called it, one about landline users. So since that was a phone survey, how do you know that one's even accurate?
Yeah, the National Health Interview Survey is not a phone survey. It's a survey done by the government. I just said that when they asked about whether your household has cell phone or landline, the results were that cell phone only household. So it wasn't only done by phone. Okay, so another issue with the wrong respondent is that many times, instead of talking to the respondent that would be able to best answer your questions, the survey organizations use a surrogate. So sometimes they might ask a parent to report for their teenager, and for a lot of topics that might be okay, but on certain topics, drug or alcohol use, you can imagine that they might not get the most accurate answers. Sometimes some business surveys, the type of person who's responding to those might be a lower level employee, and they're asked to judge the performance of heads of departments. But this issue of someone answering for someone else can cause a problem in terms of wrong respondent. Fran.
Okay, there's lots of ways that we can have the wrong question, and one of my pet peeves is what I like to call the essay question. I don't know if anyone else calls it that, but this is the open-ended response. I'll show you an example in a second. There's questions that are double-barreled. We'll go over these definitions. Leading questions, forecasting, or as I sometimes call it, the crystal ball, wrong answer choices, and poor readability. Okay, the essay question. What did you like about your recent dining experience at our restaurant? Well, what do you want me to talk about? The food, the service, the atmosphere, the noise level, what I liked, what I didn't like? It's just so wide open that there's no way that anybody could ever take these data and come up with something meaningful in terms of an estimate of how many people like the food at the restaurant or not or whatever. The double-barreled question. I must admit that I got this out of one of the frugging surveys by the League of Women Voters, as I was having trouble finding a bad example with some of these other surveys we're looking at. In view of the Supreme Court's ruling, would you support or oppose an effort by Congress to reinstate limits on corporate and union spending on election campaigns? What's wrong with this question?
What was the ruling? What was the Supreme Court's ruling?
To reinstate limits, if the Supreme Court were reinstating limits on corporate and union spending, how would you support or oppose such an effort? Question?
Most people would say, yes, I want to reinstate limits on this. And I think it presupposes an inclination. If you have to pick something, you'd say, no, let them spend as much as they want. Few people would say that.
All right.
I think some people would say, yes, limit corporate spending, not to unions.
Bingo. That is what we call the double barrel. Is that they're asking two questions in one, and if you have a different opinion about the two things, you're not going to be able to answer the question. So you need to divide this question up into two. But it's also bad for other reasons. Anybody want to comment on some other reasons they noticed?
Did they state what the ruling was before they asked the question?
No, this is a frugging survey. No. Frugging. This is the fundraising under the guise of surveys. It's not a real survey. But like I said, I went with it anyway because it was a good example. Okay. And again, I went to the frugging surveys. The ACLU, this is the one that Kristen already read, so I don't have to read the whole thing, runs a vigorous media outreach. Okay, some of these words are just charged, and that makes them leading, like the fact that they say vigorous, the fact that they're talking about mobilizing people, strengthening and expanding individual liberty in America. I mean, what could be more leading you to very important than those?
It sounds good to me.
This is what we call a valence question that, everybody's going to have to answer yes to it. Okay. All right, this next one I'm forecasting is my crystal ball. How much will you spend on iTunes in the next year? How likely are you to purchase a new iPhone in the next 3 months? Who will you vote for in the presidential primary in January 2016? Why are these a problem?
Because Americans don't budget.
Oh,
They
yes.
do, they don't stick to them.
Well, yes. And also, they might get a gift card for Christmas,
Are
so
there multiple choices for this, or like 0 to 3?
it doesn't really matter.
So
It
it's
doesn't
also an
really
essay
matter, yeah.
question.
Well, no, let's assume that these have nice categories that are well-developed. Let's assume that. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt on that.
Yeah, I know it's gonna be running in 2016 for the president anyway. So
Yes, absolutely. A question, comment?
It's just asking for a predictive answer.
Yes. And so anytime you ask people to predict something, it's going to be problematic, and it's a bad thing to do in terms of, giving somebody advice on things.
Okay, so another issue with the wrong question is what answer choices are provided. So there's some check all that apply is a category that you see often. But there's some research by Professor Don Dillman, who I talked about earlier, and it shows that people will check more things and give more accurate answers if they answer yes or no to each item, and they're forced to look at each item and answer yes or no, than compared to a check all that apply, where they start going down the list, might decide, oh, I've checked enough, and finish. Sometimes the scale that's used is unbalanced. An example might be excellent, good, fair, or poor. So here there are more positive choices than negative choices. You might see that on teacher evaluations where, they're trying to, get you to be a little more positive. Sometimes there are omitted categories where, the survey designer did not think of all the options and a respondent is, not be able to put their answer into one of the existing categories. And sometimes there's no choice for don't know or does not apply. And again, there's legitimate reasons that respondents may need to answer that, and that can be frustrating and have some data issues. Also, there can be biased answers, and I'm going to give an example next. So this is some very classic research by Professor Norbert Schwartz. So there's two ways of asking this question, and they got very different answers. They were asking about how many hours of TV respondents watched in a 1-week period. And the two category choices are here. You can read them. The example on the left has lower frequency categories. It starts with up to half hour, and the largest category is more than 2.5. And you can see the categories on the right. It starts with up to 2.5 hours, and the largest category is more than 4.5 hours. So there's a couple things going on here. So when they analyzed the results, they found that only 16.2% confessed to watching more than 2.5 hours of TV when they got the lower frequency scale on the left, but 37.5% admitted to more than 2.5 hours when they saw the scale on the right. So there's probably a couple of things that are going on here. People tend to avoid the extreme points on a scale. They might take the midpoint. They might think of themselves as average. So they'd pick a different answer. So this shows you that they're using the answer categories to interpret the question, and it can affect the types of answers you get. So here's a survey, came in a restaurant payment folder, and it says, how would you rate our service? What's wrong with that?
Which is the best, 1 or 5?
Right. There is no category. So which would you think is the best? 5, okay, but 1 is best. It's good to be number 1. Poor readability. So a big issue is, can respondents read and understand the questions that you're asking? So there's some things that, that happen here. Double negative makes it difficult to process. Jargon, vague terms. So here's an example of a double negative. This is from a Stanley Payne book from 1951, The Art of Asking Questions. We recommend this at the end. It's very old, but I love this question. Are you against not having prohibition on non-weekdays, including Sundays and holidays? There's a lot of negatives in there. That might even be a triple negative. So I don't know how you would analyze the results from that. Jargon. This is very common. It's very easy for survey researchers to be very familiar with their topic and know that terminology and assume that all respondents will as well. So this question is from a hospital survey. It says, during this visit, did this provider have your medical records? Well, medical records can mean different things to different people. You've got respondents of all ages and education backgrounds, and that might not mean the same thing to all of them. Vague terms. During this visit, did this provider seem to know the important information about your medical history? Yes, definitely. Yes, somewhat. No. Yeah, important information. That's sort of vague. What important information? Okay, another issue is the wrong time frame. Sometimes you're asking questions too early. Sometimes you're asking them too late. So too early might be, for rating purchases, where a purchase may be fine, but it quickly wears out. So if you ask too early, you're not getting an accurate rating. And the presidential election polls, as we're seeing, without a final list of candidates, it may not mimic reality at all. So, there's lots of things going on there when you're asking too early. Too late. A time frame can be too long for accurate recall if you have such a long recall period. For example, a survey 10 years after getting a PhD, which asked for methods used for your job search, might not be in people's mind. There's also something called a telescoping effect, where events are reported that are outside the time frame requested, because they're of high saliency and they meet the target, so they're not thinking about the specific time frame you gave them. So the National Crime Victimization Survey, each housing unit selected for it remains in the sample for 3 years, with each of 7 interviews taking place at 6-month intervals. And previous interviews serve as bounding interviews to keep the next time frame accurate. So if the respondent offers an event that they've already reported, it will be excluded. And that first interview, as a matter of fact, they don't use that data at all. They just use it as a bounding interview to know that none of those are going to get reported again. Fran's going to talk about respondent burden next.
Well, respondent burden is just my favorite topic of all time. Actually, a co-author and I wrote a paper, Respect Thy Respondent. Things that make it difficult for respondents is it takes too long to fill out the survey. It's difficult to navigate the survey. In the old days, it was difficult to navigate the mail survey. Today, it might be the web survey that's difficult. The questions are hard to understand. It just puts a lot of burden on people. That's why I suggested, lowering the reading level. It takes too much effort to give a good answer. You're trying to get people to come up with a number that they've really got to work very hard to get. Tasks are too difficult. People love to give ranking items on a survey. If you've got 10 items and you've got to rank them from 1 to 10, it's hard. It's really hard. Or questions just might be too sensitive and give an emotional burden. What are some sensitive topics that we've got to worry about? Drug and alcohol abuse, sex surveys, and even something innocuous as vaccine practices. We know that can become sensitive to some people, right? I know you can't read all this. This was our survey of undergraduates. The headline read, College Sexual Assault Survey Reinforces Breadth of Problem. This is an example of a sensitive question, and I've got another one that's coming up. Since you came to Rutgers, which of the following have you done? Please check all that apply. Discuss sexual assault and rape in class. You attended a rally about sexual assault or rape and so forth. So these might be a little bit sensitive, and also it's a very burdensome question. This is from the same survey, and these are the instructions or questions 25 and 26. These situations might include times, that is in questions 25 and 26, that you voluntarily consumed alcohol or drugs, and times you were given drugs without your knowledge or consent. Question 25, since coming to Rutgers, has someone had sexual contact with you when you were unable to provide consent or stop what was happening because you were passed out, drugged, drunk, incapacitated, or asleep? This question asks about events you were certain happened. Okay, this is just very, very sensitive. So if you're developing a survey with these kinds of sensitive questions, you want to make sure that you can sort of address, the fact that it's going to be sensitive. I note that this question doesn't have an unsure category, even though it talks about being certain that it happened, but that's because they want to use it for a branching question to decide which questions to go to. Okay, so Kristen's going to talk about some other survey problems.
So we've covered, the 5 major ones, but here are some other survey problems that we are also concerned about. Question order, low response rates have come up, and careless reporting of results. So question order, the order the questions are asked can affect responses, and here's an example. should a student who plagiarized be expelled? Should a professor who plagiarized be fired? So how many thought the student should be expelled? If they got the student question first, 21%. But if they got the professor question first, it was 34%. So you can see, fairly large difference. And, the hypothesis is that once you've said the professor, you hold them to a higher standard, that then you feel you have to apply. They felt like they had to apply that same standard to the student. And when they got the student first, they, were more liberal and didn't think they needed to be expelled. Low response rate. So the big issue with low response rate is that those who did not respond may be different from those who did. And a lot of survey organizations, try to make things more comparable, and they use demographic comparisons with census data to weight and to ensure. But the issue is that they don't ensure that the opinions will also be comparable. So you can even things out in terms of, race and gender and age and lots of things, but that doesn't necessarily relate to the opinions or the data that you're trying to collect. So there's few approaches to low response rates. One is weighting to adjust for low response rates, to weight up the ones you do have. Sometimes, most good surveys are doing non-response follow-up to increase response rate. And then there are non-response studies to make estimates of the differences between respondents and those who did not respond. Fran's going to talk about the Rutgers Student Survey again.
Okay, I'm going to give you a little more detail now. This is 11,700 students who responded online to the survey. There was a 28% response rate, and the findings were that about female undergraduates, that 20% reported unwanted sexual contact, 24% reported experiencing sexual violence before coming to Rutgers. Now, I wanted to tell you that the definition of sexual violence is a little different than you might expect. It not only did it include physical incidents, but also remarks about physical appearance, persistent sexual advances by unwanted recipients. So we're not going to, worry too much about, the definitions in this survey, but do you trust these findings? Okay.
Given the low response rate, it's likely to be skewed toward people who are going to answer these questions in a way, say, yes, this happened. So you've really grossly skewed that in terms of the percentage. And you can't say that 20%, that's reflective of the entire student population.
And if I told you that the survey was 20 pages of questions when you print it out, would you still think that? Yes, even more so, right?
You're selecting the respondents by the way that the low response rate and the length of the survey.
What I want to tell you is that they surveyed every student. And so this is often the problem with, surveying everybody in your population, is that you get lower response rates. Because people think, oh, somebody else can answer it. I don't need to do it. Like, oh, my roommate's going to answer it. I don't need to, and so forth. So what I would like to say, though, is the nice thing is because they surveyed everybody, that this figure is true of the 20% reported unwanted sexual contact for at least 28% of the students. So if you multiply that out, you come up with 5% of the Rutgers students experienced unwanted sexual contact. And
At a minimum.
At a minimum, and 6% experienced sexual violence before coming to Rutgers. So those questions were different. One is at Rutgers and the other one's before Rutgers. So you can, this is a case where you can say, at least this many had the problem. So if you have 5% of your students that are having unwanted sexual contact, is that a problem for your university? I would think so. That's 1 out of every 20 students is experiencing something. So you can take these data and you can take them to the bank on the 5% for sure. What you can't do is say that it's so pervasive that it's 1 in 4. Okay, let's go on because I want to get to that other one about response rate in a minute. Okay, careless reporting of results. Sometimes there's a mismatch between the survey wording and the survey reporting. So this is why if you're skeptical about the data, you think, gee, that just doesn't sound right to me, go online and get a copy of the survey questions and match them up to what the reporter wrote and see if you still agree with what the reporter concluded. There can also be careless use of sampling errors, as we saw earlier, and they can also just be a lack of information about the survey, and we'll talk more about that too. I found an example from the Consumer Reports survey on drug costs where I didn't feel like the survey wording matched, the report. All right, so the questionnaire asked about whether people had ever asked their doctor about switching prescription medicines for any of the following reasons, including wanting a less expensive medicine. So I've sort of put those in blue. But the article said, and there's a little more to it, but people said that they asked their doctor or pharmacist to switch their prescriptions to a lower cost medication. Now, in my mind, asking your doctor to switch to a lower cost medication means the doctor's going to do it. So this implies that this, whatever the percent was that they reported, that this many people switch medication. However, the question was, have you asked your doctor about switching? Maybe the doctor said this other medication's cheaper, but it has these side effects. Do you still want to switch? And you said, oh gosh, no. So I really don't feel like those questions match. Well, there was another question that they asked. During the past year, have you done any of the following in order to pay for your prescription medications? And this asked your doctor or pharmacist if there's a less expensive generic version of your brand name medication. And again, this implies that you had a discussion, not necessarily that you asked them to switch. So I feel like neither of these really support, the report. Okay, I'm going to let Kristen talk now.
So we've talked about a lot of problems with surveys, and what are some remedies for some of these survey problems? Well, one of them is pre-testing. Fran and I have both done a lot of pre-testing where you meet with respondents and have them complete the questionnaire and get their feedback before you put it in the field. And that's expensive, but it really helps iron out survey problems by testing the questions before the survey is conducted. There's also something called expert reviews. That's another way to test survey questions. It's not as reliable as using actual respondents. You might use other survey methodologists or other researchers or experts in the field or just even some random people, but you're just getting them to review it and not actually complete it as they were. Usability testing of web surveys or user experience design, that can be very useful, and that can really help with making the survey less problematic. And follow-ups, we talked about that. They're expensive, but they will encourage different types of people to respond. That can be very helpful. And as we mentioned, sponsorship is probably the most important piece of information that you need to assess a survey's results. And an unbiased organization sponsoring a survey is probably more likely to have more trustworthy survey results. So what surveys might you be able to trust? Well, these are survey organizations that, in our experience, are doing high quality research. The New York Times, Washington Post election polls, they put a lot of effort into their work. The Pew Research Center does some high quality survey research. The U.S. government statistical agencies that we mentioned. Two examples of quality efforts that are currently underway. The American Association for Public Opinion Research, APOR, I think there might be a couple of members here. Anyone here? Okay, a couple. They have a code of professional ethics and practices, and they've recently started a transparency initiative, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. And also the Office of Management and Budget does some work on quality. So the transparency initiative, survey organizations have been able to sign up since October of 2014, and they pledge to practice transparency in reporting survey-based findings, to disclose the basic methodological elements included in APOR's goal, a lot of the things we've talked about. And the goal is to encourage broader and more effective disclosure of research methods. So there's a list on apor.org of 68 participating organizations as of September 15th, and I think that's gone up a couple since then. So the Paperwork Reduction Act back in the 70s gave the Office of Management and Budget the authority to oversee surveys conducted by the executive branch. Congress thought there was too much paperwork with all the surveys. So OMB tries to coordinate that several organizations aren't asking the same questions. They try to ensure that surveys achieve high response rates. They require that surveys be pre-tested. The survey methods are subject to review by OMB. They track burden hours to keep an idea of how many burden hours are across the country, and this theoretically applies to all U.S. government surveys in the executive branch. Fran, last example.
Okay, this is a test. Okay, survey results worry gay rights activists. This is from August 2nd newspaper, 2015. Recent survey reports show lower estimate of gays in the population. The LBGT community is very concerned about this, and the focus on the family thinks it's more accurate. What do we conclude? Okay, first some data. It's our last headline. Okay, there are 3 surveys that were discussed in the article. The culprit is the first one, the 2013 National Health Interview Survey that's done by CDC, actually, is the sponsor. And these are in person, where the interviewer fills out the questionnaire on the computer. There's the 2008 General Social Survey, which was in-person interviews in the household survey. And there was the 2013 National Adult Tobacco Survey, or NATS, which unfortunate name in this area, but the NATS. And that was conducted with telephone interviews, both cell and landline. Okay, what were the results? And which one do we trust? Okay, so I included the breakout for gays and lesbians because the figure that really concerned the LBGT community was the bisexuals, because you can see the latest survey from the Health Interview Survey only showed that 0.7%, and the survey of the NAT survey showed up to 1.6%. So there's a full percent there that they lost, and you can see in the totals 2.3% gays, including bisexuals, up to 3.5%. So the LBGT communities are saying, well, why isn't the tobacco survey, the accurate one? Because these are both conducted by CDC. Well, what do we think about the survey quality? I will tell you these response rates, 61%, 70%, and 45% for the telephone survey. The other 2 were, in person. Then we've got the number of respondents, 35,000, oh my gosh, 2,000 for the GSS, and 60,000 for the NATS. Which survey, if you didn't know anything about the results and you just looked at the bottom 2 lines, which survey would you trust the most? Okay, I'm going to let Sid answer this now. What do you think? Maybe you don't agree with me.
Well, I think the answer you're fishing for is the 2008 GSS survey because it has the highest response rate.
No. My professional opinion is the National Health Interview Survey is the one, because it's more recent, it's got a huge sample, and it's got a really decent response rate. And I also, like I said before, I know that they've done all this work, which I'm a little bit prejudiced because I actually know the woman who wrote the report, on the questionnaire. But no, seriously, looking at this, the NAT survey, 45% response rate. Well, what happened to the other half of the people? I don't know that I trust that. I really don't know. And I think it's fine for them to publish the data in terms, they published a lot of reports. Well, they published a report that had lots and lots of data about smoking among gays versus straights, and they found that gays smoke more than straights. Who knew? So they've got some interesting data, and I think they can do that kind of thing. But I think when you're trying to look at this point estimate, I would go with the National Health Interview Survey, because they've been around a longer time, and they know what they're doing. Okay, let's have a summary, and then we'll open the floor to other questions. Okay. Look for transparency, the kinds of things that you need to look for, or organizations who reveal their methods of the copy of the questionnaire, a description of how they did, what mode they used, was it telephone, in person, sampling plans and sampling errors, response rates, very critical to know the response rates for if you trust them or not. Did they do pre-testing, and if they had interviewers, did they do training? These are things that add to the quality that make you trust the results more.
How do you know this, though?
You go and look on the internet. And if they don't tell you about this, they may not be that high of a quality organization.
What kind of response rate are you looking for? I'm looking
for 60%. I'm looking for 60%. You're not always going to find that. And there are some people doing some weighting and so forth trying to get it up, from where they get it. But the government surveys, and I think, nobody in here said they trust the government surveys more than anything else, but they're the ones that are getting the high response rates because OMB requires it. They have to get high response rates. And also GAO, who doesn't have to go through OMB, also gets fantastic response rates. We've got the Dillman book. This is the textbook, the Bible right now, in our opinion, of surveys. If you want to, start with this one, if you want some really, a lot of information, very high quality, based on research that he's done with the students over the years. If you want something fun, go pick up The Art of Asking Questions by Stanley Payne. It is hysterical, but it also has very, very good information in it. And of course, as you read any coverage of survey results, be skeptical. I don't think I have to say that for this group, but thank you so much, and we appreciate coming today. Okay, questions?
What's the state of the art here in 2015 on dealing with the population that doesn't have landline phones? How are survey takers adjusting?
I think as you know, I think the current thinking is that you have to do both. You have to sample from both the cell phone and the landline. But I think there was more concern when people were paying for minutes, and back in the day people didn't want to talk to anybody on their cell phone. And now I think there's less concern about that. So as long as you're covering both of those populations, you're still going to have some response rate issues getting people on the phone. But I think as long as you're doing both cell phone and landline, you're usually addressing that issue. Fran, is that your sense?
Yeah, I think so. Although I really worry about that National Adult Tobacco Study only getting 45% response doing telephone only. I really worry about that because, but that wasn't one of the statistical agencies doing that survey. So I think if Census or BLS had done it, I think they would have gotten a higher response rate. Yes, go ahead.
If you're surveying to answer a question that's of general interest to the entire population, how much credibility does the survey lose if they use a convenience sample as opposed to a probability sample?
Yeah, I mean, huge. That was obviously why those pseudo surveys that we talked about earlier, made us nervous and make us skeptical, because the convenience samples, you just don't have any sense of what you're getting there. And so, for us, with our, survey methodology background, we don't feel comfortable drawing conclusions from surveys that aren't probability-based with good, response rates and good design. But, as Sid said, depending on your purpose and what you're doing with the data, there are other purposes for those sorts of surveys. Do you have a comment on that, Sid?
I had a comment about something else. I think you were talking at the time, at the very beginning of the presentation, you use as example restaurant surveys, customer feedback, customer satisfaction surveys. You called them pseudo surveys? Did I misunderstand that?
I think we put it under that category.
Why would that be a pseudo survey?
Well, again, because it's sort of a volunteer survey where you're giving it to everybody, and whatever small percentage is returning it, they're not doing follow-up. It's not, it's not a probable. They're not sampling necessarily and following up.
It's a survey, but the methodology is weaker.
Yes, that's what we're trying to say. Yeah, that's what we mean by that. It's not that it's not a survey, but they're not probability-based.
It's not as much
quality.
of a pseudo survey as the frugging, perhaps, but it's still not as reliable as a probability sample.
There's a long tradition of making a distinction between probability surveys and non-probability surveys. I don't think you should consider all non-probability surveys pseudo surveys.
Okay.
That's sort of what the impression you were giving up.
Okay, I think what we're trying to do is say, when are you most skeptical? You're most skeptical if it's a convenience sample or a volunteer survey. That's when you're more skeptical about the results. That's when you dig down and deeper. There was this survey that was done, I don't know how long ago this was, by the Columbus Dispatch, and they got a 10% response rate. Now, what they did is they mailed it out to their readers, and they got it back, and they only got 10% back. But it was more predictive of the elections than the ones that they were doing at the university, where they got much higher, response rates than the ones they were doing over the phone. And this is John Krosnick's example. And why do you think that was? Why do you think the results were more accurate?
They got actual voters.
That's what I thought. I thought they got if you're ready to fill out a survey and mail it back, you're more likely to get to the polls too. These are more organized folks, and that's what I thought too. So,
But let's go ahead and give them a thank you.